than if you just give them a picture and say, or if you give them a sentence, or if you give them a starter and ask them to, they actively, just give me one reason. And that starts them off on their learning journey, because we all have difficult groups. Other ideas, there's a whole section on funks that I think Sam is doing next, and I'm sure some of you will go to, so I'm not going to say too much about that. The what if ones are the ones that I like. What if teapots were all made of chocolate, how would that work? I think it'd be quite nice for me, because I love a cup of tea more often. Connecting keywords. I use this a lot. If you have keywords and you can colour code them, so if you have red and blue words, okay, everybody has to connect the blue words. If the red words, if you want to challenge yourself, connect the red ones as well. And they have to make a connection, and they have to say what the connection is. It's quite a good AFL starter for them. Grab an idea, exchange and mark. If they've got one idea on their post-its, you have to have the chairs underneath, because they usually run around the room and it all gets a bit frenetic. But then they've got 30 seconds to go and gather as many other ideas as they can before they come back, and then they use that to start the first piece of work. As the teacher, it goes against our nature, because we want to be there with the children. Actively being disengaged gets them engaged with their learning, because they're not relying on you. I have one colleague who now works in another school. He literally leaves the room. Dangerous strategy, but he will literally leave the room in order to make sure that the students, he only stands out there just outside the door, they don't know that, but if you're busy at your desk when they're doing it, you're unavailable. So it doesn't have to be you physically leave the room. Our school organisation, and I said I'd relate this to our school, we have for several years, just like every school, continually been on this journey to improve teaching and learning. And like Kev was saying this morning in the keynote, you get this latest strategy that everyone must do and blah. And actually, teachers are very, very good, and I think they're very clued up in the ways in which, they take from the strategy what works for them. They do enough to tick that box, and then, we're very good at that. And I think that actually that's not going to, that will get you to a certain level, but it doesn't help the children in the long term. You know your children best, you know what works with them, and what we've set up are 4 teams. We've set up 4 pedagogy teams. The leaders are not from SLT, they're not subject leaders, they are teachers in the classroom that have great ideas and want to do this. They're very keen to do this. And although we gave them, the 4 banners came out of an audit we did of staff of things that they wanted to do that were cross-curricular. So you'll recognise them because they do tie in with Ofsted, but that's not the reason we did it. We did it from what staff wanted. And each member of staff opted to go into one of those teams. Those teams have developed organically. As SLT, we have not said to them, you have to do this, you have to have this product at the end, you have to do, haven't done any of that. We simply said, okay, this is your banner you're working under, you've got this much time, you've got this much resource, you've got this much time off timetable, you've got this much joint planning time, you've got this amount of money. You develop it how you want to. And there's been some absolutely, I don't use the word awesome lightly, but there's been some absolutely awesome things that have come out of that. Some of which I'm going to share with you. But it's teachers who are working together to kind of say, well, I'm interested in developing this. What about this? How does this work? They've tried it out, and then other teachers have seen what they're doing, and they feel safer because somebody else has already done it. And they'll say, oh, can I try that? And then you end up with a slightly bigger team working on something. And in that way, it's spread organically. We also looked at what does challenge and engagement in lessons look like. Because anyone, any person who observes lessons and says they can go in and say, yes, I asked the children and they said they were all challenged. Best will in the world, if your students like you, somebody says to them, if I'm observing a lesson, I go and say, do you feel challenged? Yes, miss. But what we tried to look for was if a lesson is flowing well, and if there is sufficient engagement and challenge, what kinds of things could you see? And these are the things that generally came up. I'm not saying in every lesson, I'm not saying you will see all of them, but these are the things. So the appropriately challenging, I've got some examples of how different people in our school do it. I've already mentioned the minimal input from teachers. And that doesn't mean they don't give any input, but it's very well thought out. I don't know if any of you, I'm sure you all follow Zoe Elder on Twitter, if you're on Twitter, and I'm sure you've already read her fantastic book. She talks a lot about thinking through and being very minimal in the way that you make interventions in the classroom. That's not to say you don't make them, that's not to say that they have huge impact when you do make them, but it's important that we're not getting in there and doing it for them. Learning skills are embedded or explicitly taught. We all have skills that are needed for our lessons, for our particular subject, but what learning skills do children need? The goals are clear and worthwhile, feedback is immediate, tasks are interesting and motivating. Now that can be difficult, because for 30 children, they might find different things interesting and motivating, so it's about just kind of doing what you can. Sharing the big picture. It's not about, can you name 5 countries that begin with C? Can you draw a river, the longest river that goes through Africa? Can you name the 72 books in the Bible? That kind of learning. I think there's a book out at the moment, isn't it? Why do I need a teacher when there's Google? It's about learning the why. How is it useful? What's the big picture? How does that fit into their frame of reference? This is one of the strategies. This is a very early one, and I have to say not the best example we've got. A lot of staff started using something which is called a pen portrait. And it breaks down the groups, but now many of the teachers have got ones. So if you've got a particular child in your group that doesn't fit into any of those categories, but when you're planning, you very much have to bear them in mind. So when you're planning, you're doing your medium or short-term planning, you've got this. And then it helps you when you're planning your activities to think about, well, okay, what do I need to do for that group of children? How can I differentiate this task to make sure that this happens? And, that was the original format, and again, that's developed. And this came out of the work of a group of 3 teachers who said that when they're planning, they often forget. You're planning a lesson, you'll think, oh, this would work, that would, but you're not thinking about the individuals. So this was a way of doing that. Sharing the big picture. David, let's get his name on, Dido, who's here. He's got a brilliant example on his blog of, a frame that he just shares the big picture of learning. Some people do it through learning loops, some people do it through words. I often use riddles and things to share with them. Okay, this is what our learning is going to hinge on today, and we come back to that at the end. Sorry, I'm talking very fast, but please stop me if you've got questions or you want to. This was in English. I literally walked into an English lesson earlier in the week, and this was an example. It's not a very good picture, I'm afraid. But when they were doing a task, and this is constant across English, they use levels and they model what for each level it looks like, and I'm sure lots of other people use that. But where there are things that they may not be secure on, the teachers put in red, the effect on the audience. We will discuss this because they know from their class that isn't something they can do already. So they're reassuring the child, because alongside the work that the 4 pedagogy groups have done, SLT have spent hours and hours and hours sitting down with children and asking them, what does learning look like? What works best for you? How does this work? What happens then? Because although there are things that across all schools can help, your school is also a microcosm, and what might work in one school doesn't work in your school for whatever reason. So instead of relying on research which is global, we've very much looked at research that we've undertaken research in our school with our pupils. There's a huge debate about how you do lesson objectives, how you word them, what you should use. I know there are some schools who insist you use balloons, there are some schools that insist you use levels in your learning objectives. There are some schools that use WILF, WALT, whatever the acronym of the day is. You may be lucky in your school and there's no dictation about how you do them. Certainly we moved away from. As a school, we used to use WALT and WILF. I have to say, I'm not a fan. I hate them. Sounds like your creepy uncle's having for lunch. What we did was we said to all staff, as long as you've got a learning objective, it doesn't matter what format it is in, as long as you share it with people, and it may not always be possible or appropriate to share it at the beginning of the lesson. If there's something about your structure of your lesson on that day you want to share at the end, not at the beginning, that's fine, as long as there is one that is clear. Solo I'll talk a little bit about. Again, there's going to be people that are much better than I talking about solo today, but solo is something, ironically, I picked it up from Twitter and I experimented with it, was using it with my classes. Brilliant, loved it. And then on Twitter I had a conversation, some of you might follow Peter Blenkinsop. He's an educational consultant and runs something called an Outstanding Teacher Programme, which a lot of our staff go on. He told them about solo because he got it from me, and then they brought it back into school and now they're all using it. So when I say he got it from me, he picked up the hashtag that I was using and then discovered that there were hundreds of other people using it and how brilliant it is. But metacognition, some of you who use BLP or have used BLP may recognise that term. Or growth mindsets, a lot of the work that Carol Dweck does is very much focused on making pupils believe that they can do it. And what we found from our pupils is actually, even if you think they're positive, a lot of the time they have a very fixed view about what they can and can't do. And even pupils that you think are very positive in your lesson, if you sit down with them and say, oh, are you good at this? Can you do that? They'll say no, and they're very kind of reluctant to open themselves up to that. I said I was going to talk about solo. For those of you who are not sure, there's loads of stuff online. Tate Coles that did a session in the first part, he's got some really good stuff on his blog. David Dido's got some really good stuff. Lisa Jane Ashes has got some really good stuff. I feel like a bit of a fraud stood up here, to be honest, because I'm just sharing this, and there's all these great people that you could be watching. But solo, if you haven't looked at it, it's worth a look. I'm not saying that it's right for everybody, and I'm not saying, but certainly structuring learning outcomes and learning objectives from it, even if you don't explicitly teach the children about solo, can be really useful in terms of their learning. Did anybody go to Tate Cole's session in the first part? Yeah. Okay, a couple of people. Did he talk about question formulation technique?
No, he skipped over it.
Right. I went to see him in Newcastle, and I immediately left that session. I thought, oh, this looks really good. And I had a window with my Year 8 class where I knew for 4 hours of learning time I wasn't going to be with them because I had to, I was pulled out of class to go and do something else. So, and I was teaching Judaism for about the 10 billionth time, and I couldn't find a way of thinking, this is great, this is what, So basically I used this with them. And I just asked them, in about 15 minutes at the end of the last lesson I was going to see them, to just write down every question they've ever wanted to know about Judaism or Jews or the history of Jews or whatever. So they just wrote down millions of questions. They wrote them all down on the desk. My cleaner went mad. Then they took photographs of them, and in the following lesson they then used this technique to pare it down into the questions they actually wanted to research. They then had 2 hours of research time, which they used to then find the answers to their questions. But they weren't allowed to copy and paste, they weren't allowed to use one resource, they had to use 2 or 3 resources, there are restrictions on it. Some of the questions they came up with, what pets are Jews allowed? Apparently the thinking behind it was, well, if they have kosher food, is there a restriction on the type of pets they're allowed? I hadn't thought of that, but thought it was a great question. What do they wear for their school uniform? or a wedding at weekend. You know, what are they allowed to wear, basically? If we're Christians, why was Jesus Jewish? And does circumcision hurt? Came from a boy. You know, they were just some of the questions, but you know. And then, after the 2 hours of thinking time and research time, they then presented their work. And I happen to use hexagons. I know that's how most people see solo. It's not the only way of using solo. But they put together the main facts that they'd find out. And then what they had to do within the whole class was go and find other people they could link theirs with and then explain the links. So they were then putting together sections of Judaism. And actually what they ended up with was a very clear, so they ended up with customs, they ended up with religious teachings, they ended up with festivals and ceremonies, and they ended up with day-to-day life. And they put all that together. I was actually sat at the front having a cup of tea while they were all doing this. Great, it's the best festival at all. This is my lovely class that did all of that. They wanted their picture up here. Sorry. The other way of supplementing what you're doing, if you've got your learning objectives, often if you do an opening task with them, there are more questions that come out of that. And what I get the pupils to do is to write the question on the board, and then at any point during the lesson, if they can think of something that relates to that question, if they've got a part of the answer, they just come up at any point in the lesson and they add to it. I give one person, have you seen those easy buttons that you can press and it goes, life's easy? It's the only one I could find. And so one of the pupils is the monitor, is the observer during a particular lesson. And when they think there's enough information up there, they press the button. And they then have to stand up to the class and explain from the evidence that everybody else has put up there what the answer, or a hypothesis, if you like, to the answer to the question. The deaf people hear their conscience was an interesting one. Didn't get too much on that, but it's the type of questions that they come up with that I think in a way you just have to run with. Whole class questioning. Feedback, I work with NQTs and PGCs in Bristol, and often what they get, the feedback they get from lesson observations is that whole class questioning is not engaging, and it doesn't involve everyone, and the same pupils tend to get, and it can be a danger that we all fall into. A very simple technique is the extend or challenge. So if one person's answered part of the question, the next person you say to them, are you extending or challenging? So are they adding something to the answer, or are they going to challenge it? You know, and obviously it brings in then some of the higher order skills. I'm sure you've seen this, Think, Pair, Share. It's one of the Kagan learning cooperatives. Again, from the research we've done with pupils, some of the pupils, particularly who don't view themselves as being academically able, get really scared that the teacher is going to pick on them and they don't know the answer. One of the strategies you can use, this is the question, so you have the question up, right, you've got 2 minutes to talk to the person next to you, then you've got 2 minutes to speak in a four, and then one person speaks, so you then, you know. It's a really simple technique, and I'm sure other people use it, but in a different way. Home expert groups? Yeah, a lot of people nodding. If you've got a group, so if they're sat in fours like they are in here, this will be your home group. And then what you would do is you get each person to go to a different table, and you'd have a different activity. They then bring that back to their home group, and the job of each person who's gone to do something else is that they come back and they teach it to everybody else. So they need each bit of the knowledge to answer whatever big question you've got. Obviously you can differentiate the resources, so when they go off to their expert groups, you can differentiate it depending on level and the challenge and all of those things. Different forms of feedback, which I'm sure everybody uses, that students, lessons where students felt most affirmed and like they could develop their answers was where they left the lesson with clear feedback about how they'd done. And simple things like them giving a one-word answer on a post-it and somebody else commenting on it, or marking drafts for them, self-peer, and then teacher assessment, those kinds of things. Stealing an answer is something that I saw in a maths lesson, which I'd never seen before. Basically, they were working in groups. And it's another variation on the, three before me or book body boss thing where, you avoid the teacher being the one to do all the interventions. And there were 3 or 4 children who couldn't find the answer. So the teacher then said, okay, go steal. So all the children who didn't understand something had to go and find somebody that did understand it. And then there was a bit of peer teaching going on. My WordPress account is apparently there, but I haven't added the things to it yet, and that's me on Twitter. Thank you very much. I'm sure there's about 10 minutes left. I'm sure you've got many more things that you can offer that are much better than those, and you've probably got more things, or if you've got questions or anything like that. Do you want to talk amongst yourselves?
It's a notepad app on the iPad. Set the page to the side of Zoom on that. Last one, the photos on the it's just a style, that's the ends. Notice Plus.
Yeah, I'm good. How are you? I need to like steal some ideas from yeah, well, with my chair around. I started my job like really we just yeah, we do have and then